this side of the room? I'm just kidding. What's going on over here? Yeah. Okay. We're going to go ahead and get started. I think there are some people still who may trickle in, but we'll just go ahead and dive right in. Thank you guys for attending. All right. I'm Stephanie Bailey. I'm a CPA and partner at Core Business Advisors. We are a small accounting firm in Oklahoma City, and we specialize in tax compliance and advisory, both on the for-profit side, but also we have a really specialized niche area with nonprofit expertise. And then also we provide accounting services, bookkeeping, outsourced controller, and fractional CFO services as well. My background, I started my career in public accounting. I was a director at KPMG in their tax exempt organization, and I led one of their regional practices there, specializing in healthcare, higher education, private foundations, and other exempt organizations like public charities and just 501c3s in general. And then I've been the CFO for a couple of nonprofits locally in Oklahoma City before coming on to Core Business Advisors. So one of the things that's been really great, I think, about my background, and kind of yesterday I talked a lot about tax, and today we're going to talk about budgeting. Sometimes it's great to be able to kind of marry those two and talk about them in a little bit more practical way, and really help you all apply it to the day-to-day needs of your organization. And I'm so happy to be here. I feel like the work you all are doing, really boots on the ground and volunteer-led, is so important to support the needs of your communities. So thank you for inviting me. Okay. Our main focus today is going to be on budgeting. We're going to really think about it in three components, just based on sort of generally what most of the organizations attending the conference are, kind of the type of work and type of funding that you all have. And so thinking about annual operating budgets, when we think about an annual operating budget, it's really made up of kind of smaller components. So you all may conduct certain fundraising events. I know, most of you, if not all, get grants from the Cherokee Nation. And so thinking about separate grant budgets that may roll up into your overall annual operating needs. And then, program revenue or memberships or whatever other type of revenue stream that you have. That's generally where we're going to focus. And thinking about things like resource management and sustainability for the long term, and really hoping that you can walk away with some really great practical tools to be able to take back to your organizations. One of the things that might be kind of helpful just to help guide the presentation, make sure that it's really meaningful for everybody who's here. How many folks in the room sort of oversee or have a hand in kind of the financial aspect of the nonprofit that you work with? Okay, great. And then how many are really actually in charge of maybe preparing a budget or a grant budget? 1, 2. Okay, kind of the same folks. Okay, great. And who in here has maybe not ever prepared a budget for the organization? Everyone has prepared a budget? No? Okay, all right. Okay. Well, I'm going to tell you, this is going to be really kind of step-by-step and really intended to be a tool for non-accountants. The session is specifically designed for you all and for volunteers who don't have an accounting background, and really just the goal is to kind of help you think through how could I build a budget and what needs to go into it and what are the considerations. The other thing I'll share is kind of why all of this matters. So one, ultimate goal is sustainability for your nonprofit, right? Ensuring that you have sufficient funding, sufficient cash needs to be able to, continue to offer ongoing programming. The other thing that budgeting can help with is it really, if you have a sound, well thought out, organized budget, then that really gives funders more confidence in the operations that you're dealing with, right? So it kind of says, hey, we know what our plan is, we have a plan, and this is what we're going to do and how we're planning to navigate working through this year or this grant or this project or whatever it may be. And then really just sort of minimizing surprises along the way as well. I've been a board member for several nonprofits, and which they always stick. I'm always on the finance committee, always, which is fine. But it really helps keep the board from being surprised or caught off guard if it's like, hey, you know, we have this event coming up and maybe we can't afford all the expenses that we had anticipated. So really budgeting can kind of help mitigate some of that surprise element as well. Nobody likes to be surprised, especially when it comes to money. The thing too I want to mention is just everything that we are going to talk about is really doable, right? Everybody, you know, we all have our own checking accounts, we all have our own, you know, credit card or bank account or personal budget, and so some of this is going to follow some of that same structure, and so it's intended to be really practical. And if you have questions along the way, please ask. The last session I spoke on this was really interactive, and I think it made it more interesting and more helpful for everybody involved when it's like, hey, this is what we do, or what about this? So please feel free to speak up. I know we're getting to the end of day 2 and everybody maybe starting to run out of gas, but promise we'll keep it as upbeat as we can. It's one thing about the morning session, everybody came with their coffee. They were ready to go. So I should set up a coffee station in here for afternoon next time. When we're thinking about budgeting for organizations of your size, really we're kind of focusing on these 2 primary revenue streams. So some of those smaller fundraising activities and then grants primarily from the Cherokee Nation, but there could be grants from other organizations. When I think about budgeting, I think it's really important to think about it in those pieces. So what are kind of the components of our business? Do we have ongoing fixed costs that we need to think about? Insurance is one of those, right? If your organization owns a building or had a building donated and you're carrying the insurance costs on it, thinking about that's something that you know you're going to have to write that check every month, and there's also potential for that cost to go up. So, you know, with inflation, we're seeing insurance rates skyrocket along with just the cost of goods and food and everything else. And really thinking about what in my budget or in my organization's operations, what's predictable, what's likely to happen, versus what are the things that maybe I can't control. And one of the examples I gave in the last section was, I live in Oklahoma City, and we have an annual arts festival every year, and without fail, it rains, like pouring down monsoon rain at the arts festival. So you have all these artists who come in from all of these different states, and it used to be a whole week, and now it's down to 4 days, and it's inevitably gonna rain. It just always does. So those artists have to keep in their mind, hey, I wanna sell this much art, but I know I'm probably gonna lose at least 1 day, maybe 2, in sales to that rain. So predictable versus unpredictable. Let's say your annual fundraiser is an event at a state fair and it's outside and it could rain, and if you're only there for 1 day, that could really impact your annual budget if your kind of overall budget is really dependent on that specific event. So always thinking about what's predictable, what's not, what can we control, and then also thinking through potential contingency plans if it's gonna be a main part of your funding. I think also thinking about the likelihood, if you've been receiving grants, of receiving that grant again, and in what amount, right? So if you normally receive a $5,000 grant from Cherokee Nation every year and everything is sustainable and your expectation is to continue to have that funding, then that's what you would budget for. But if you received maybe a unique grant in the prior year that was much larger, maybe that's unexpected for this year, you don't want to just assume the same as last year for that. Makes sense. Okay. One of the other pieces to this is, and I think Adam can also, speak to this, I'm sure. Our nonprofits are continuing to do more and more and more with less and less and less, right? Especially volunteer-led organizations, you're doing so much with really limited resources. And part of the strength and kind of power of a budget or planning and really looking with that kind of forward-thinking mentality when it comes to this is really trying to move away from like, hey, we're just trying to survive the day-to-day, and really trying to look at long-term sustainability for the organization. Okay, we already touched on a little bit of this, kind of starting with what you know. We have some templates in here that I'm going to walk through. The other thing I want to share is that the slides will be provided, and so we'll have some examples, but those will be given to you when the slide deck goes out. The other thing that I offered up to the other group is I'm going to actually send out some Excel version of budget templates so that you all can utilize that resource. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, but just know that everything that's up here you'll have access to. Okay. One of the key pieces in this also is just don't overcomplicate it. Again, I'm going to walk through some basic templates that I might use in a sort of operation like the ones that you all are running. But it's really not about perfection. I think sometimes budgeting can be a little bit intimidating, or you think, well, if I'm going to do it, then I have to have it in Excel, or it has to be perfect, or we don't have QuickBooks, or whatever the barrier is. And I think a really important key thing to think about as we walk through some of this is put a budget in whatever format is helpful for you, right? You know your organization best, you know what it needs, you know sort of the grand scope of your activities and the cadence for when you receive funding and where it comes from and what your expenses are. And so if really it's incredibly predictable and it's kind of the same thing every year and you're not worried about it, right, you can have a really simple budget. But I would just say try not to worry too much about what it looks like or if it's perfect, and just make sure that it's something that you can actually use. And the other piece too is really encouraging the budget process should really never be just a one-person job. So thinking that other folks in the organization or on the board or volunteers or whoever it may be, they may have some knowledge or some background or some history that you may not have. And so it's always nice to say, if you want to create your first budget or have it readily available and that's what you're going to bring to the board, at least maybe get input from at least one or two other people, if not the full board, on what that is. A couple of reasons. One, the board is ultimately responsible for the budget and for the financial health of the organization. That is all board members, not just the treasurer or the designated volunteer who's in charge of the budget or filing the 990N or whatever it may be. It's the entire board's responsibility to really have ownership over that piece and the financial health for the organization. The other thing is you're more likely to get to a more realistic budget the more people who are involved. So it doesn't need to be 1 million people or everyone, but I think also getting the buy-in from the board helps create goal congruency where it says, hey, we all discussed this. We had nice written assumptions. We said this is what was going to take place during the year. This is our best guess. None of us have crystal balls, but at least then it's a shared responsibility, which I think is a much better place for most people than, well, Susie did the budget and she forgot to put this in it, right? And we never saw it, right? So at the end of the day, kind of doesn't matter whose fault it is. Let's try to make that a shared responsibility on the front end so that the organization can be in the best possible place. We don't need to spend a lot of time on this, but in my sessions yesterday, in-kind donations came up, and so I wanted to speak to that just a little bit. An in-kind donation is going to be something the organization receives that's either a good or a service. And so let's say someone donates, you provide diapers to mothers in need in rural areas, and let's say that Walmart donates a bunch of diapers for you to distribute for that cause, right? So you would want to take the fair market value of that donation and actually show revenue for that, right? Because that's something that you received that has value that then you're using to carry out your mission. Okay, so I think sometimes some of those donated items, they get lost. And when you're looking to funders for additional grant revenue or even at events or going out in the public, I think it's really helpful to be able to kind of take credit in a sense for that revenue as well, because it's helping you run your nonprofit, right? And then keeping in mind that just for reporting purposes, and we'll see this on the next slide, that you're going to recognize revenue for that or income, and then you're going to have a corresponding expense. So maybe diaper expense for the same amount. So you don't show a net higher income, but it is really good to see both of those items. And if you were audited or something for some reason, then you would want to show that as recognized, okay? Now, for those of you who may file a Form 990 EZ or a 990 for tax purposes, in-kind donations are not recognized on the Form 990 as part of your income statement. Okay, they may be reportable on a different schedule depending on the threshold, but there is a little bit of a disconnect between the two types of reporting. Mm-hmm. This is in kind. Yep. So if for tax purposes. Yep. Then yes, those would be reported. Yes, you've got it. Yeah, it's kind of complicated. Sometimes I debate. I wasn't even going to bring up the tax piece, but I was talking about financial reporting for in-kind donations, and people were like, well, what about the tax return? I'm like, okay, yeah, it's different. And then the other thing to remember is if you're receiving donated services, thinking through that in some cases those would be reportable for your financial statements. That's going to be for very specialized services. So if you have a CPA who is preparing your tax return pro bono, then that would be a specialized service, and you could recognize the fair market value of those services as revenue and expense. But if it's someone who, if it's a service that's not actually being used, like board service or something like that, or just volunteering at the state fair event or something like that, that's not going to be considered an in-kind service because it's not specialized. So usually it's going to be legal, CPA, or I would venture to say if you knew someone who did HVACs and they came and specifically repaired that and it would have otherwise cost $4,000 or something for a for-profit company to do it, that would maybe count as well. But those sometimes get missed. They get missed with budgeting, and they get missed with when you're actually reporting on your financials. And I just want to make sure that, one, it should be reported, but also I want, as a nonprofit, for you to get credit for that because you would otherwise be paying for it. The other reason for budgeting purposes specifically that it's helpful to keep track of all of that in-kind donation activity that you have is because sometimes it may not continue to always be in kind. So, your tax person may say, hey, we've done your return pro bono for the last 3 years, but we're going to have to start charging you next year or in 2 years. So if you already have it reported as an in-kind budget item, then it'll trigger in your head to say, oh, I need to actually budget that as a true expense that we're going to have to pay for this year. So that's kind of why I brought it up. A little bit of a tangent. And the same for donated space. If someone is, if you're hosting an event and they are providing the space for free, that could also be an in-kind service. Okay, here is just a sample budget. Again, I'm going to put something together in Excel that you guys can use and kind of play with. But this is really just intended kind of for visual purposes. So your top category is going to be all of the revenue, all of the income that the organization is receiving to support its mission. So that could be donations, fundraising revenue, grant income. It could also be, again, other program revenue if you're actually running a program where there are fees involved, membership dues, anything like that. And so you take your total income, I think I have a pointer, yeah. And then you list all of your expenses here. And so you might have program supplies, other fundraising expenses that supported the fundraising event that you put on, insurance costs, transportation costs, whatever that may be, to get your total expenses. And then you're gonna take your total income and subtract your total expenses to get this net income. And that's likely gonna be the cash that you have left over at the end of the year if you operated exactly how you had budgeted. And you could either allocate that to cash reserves or to some other capital expenditure or whatever the organization needs, or save it for a rainy day. When I think about developing budgets like this, I'm going to say a couple of things. One, and we're going to go through a fundraising event budget and a grant budget, keeping in mind that you may have little mini budgets that build into your big budget. So if you have a fundraising event, you probably want to know exactly what the revenue and expenses from that fundraising event are going to be. And then you're going to want to take your grant revenue, if it's project-based with the Cherokee Nation, and they say, hey, we're going to provide $5,000 and we want you to, execute project XYZ, and you provide those services, then that's kind of its own component. And then you may have additional ongoing administrative expenses for the organization that are outside of those specific areas. So to get your consolidated kind of total budget, you're going to want to add all of those buckets together. The other piece is if you are starting the budget process today, there are a couple of approaches for kind of structuring it from the get-go. One, last year is a great guide, right? Unless you just did something last year that was totally unique and different from what you're planning to do for the future year, it's a really great place to start. Okay, so thinking about that. And if you don't already have books and records or financials or something to pull from that, the bank statements are a really great resource for that as well. So if you pull all of your bank statements or even pull your annual statement, you're going to be able to see, hey, these are the deposits that we had come in during the year. We know we got the $5,000 grant. We know we had all of these, donations from this fundraising event, and then people bought tickets for this, and our bake sale was like off the charts, and we got $500 there, like whatever it is, right? And so you'd be able to see that in the bank statements. The expenses might be a little bit harder, but what's nice about looking at the bank statements for expenses, that you're going to be able to see what's recurring. Oh yeah, we have that electric bill every month, right, that comes out of our account. So you need to have a line item budget for that, or whatever it may be. And then you can look at larger expenses and say, oh yeah, we had that unique expense last year. We had to fix the HVAC, but we won't have that again this year. So the bank statements, if you have nothing else, are a really great place to start. The other piece, if you do have financials that have already recorded your actual financial activity, then you can just use that as a starting point for your budget, right? Well, next year's budget is going to literally be the actuals for this year. That's better than nothing, right? At least it gives you some sort of jumping off point. And then as you go through the year, you can take that initial budget and say, oh yeah, okay, now that I'm planning for next year, I know that this will be different, and you can kind of make tweaks to it. One of the other questions that came up, and I'm going to switch to this other one. One of the other questions that came up was, when is the best time to start a budget? How many folks are calendar year filers, or do you know? Calendar year? Okay, fiscal year, you have to be one. You have to be one or the other. Okay, we're gonna assume calendar year. If you're a calendar year organization and your year runs from January to December, then I would normally start budgeting in October. You could do it in November or December. I just always know the holidays get really busy and then I run out of time and I rush. So October, November, December, that's going to be a great time to start pulling some of this information together. And you can use all of the historical information you have through October or November or whatever year to date at that point in time, and then utilize that as your jumping off point for your budget, okay? The other thing about budgets is they are essentially, oh, yes. Okay. When do you find out what you're receiving from CAUTA?
Usually we have a deadline,
Mm-hmm.
and then you're 24.
Okay.
Sometimes
Okay. I'm really glad that you brought that up because I think it's an important point. So for those who maybe didn't hear, so for the COTA grants, did I say that right?
Yeah.
Okay. You may apply for that grant in November, but you may not find out if you are going to receive it or what the actual amount that you're going to receive until February. So if your year's already started, your budget would already be done, you may not know what to put for that. I would say use your best guess. And that's again looking kind of back if you receive 5,000 every year or whatever that may be. And if you're worried about it or if you're asking for maybe more than you normally have, you could be conservative and maybe request what you think is probable, and maybe don't budget for what the extra you're hoping to get is. But I think it's just a best guess. I don't recommend generally updating budgets during the year, but budgets are a tool that are intended to help you. And so it also kind of depends what you're using it for. If you're just using it for planning, then in February, when you figure out, hey, we received 7,500 instead of 5,000, just update your budget.
Well, the other thing is if we say one,
Mhm. Yep.
so we can we can just use it back.
Right.
Very, very specific. If anything we find different, we have to have some bid and with it. So, and we have to have the money spent before September 30th.
Yeah.
So it's like it starts in the previous calendar year and ends at the current plan.
Right. Yeah, it's just timing. I mean, I think part of it is, estimating the best you can. One thing for that I might recommend, and the template I'm going to share is going to have a 12-month budget, right? So maybe that's where you build some of that out, because this annual format may not work for you if there's some uncertainty built in within there where you say, hey, we budgeted for this printer, but we know that, are you going to buy the printer regardless of whether you receive the funding or not? Right? Like it needs to be in the grant period also. So you could put that printer expense in your budget for February or for March when the funding would also be there. That's probably what I would recommend. And then go in and tweak it if it changes. Yeah. To that point, your budget is, you can build a budget, but if you don't use it, it's really of no use, right? And so thinking through what are some ways that we can use the budget, and the best way, because the budget is really just a plan, right? It's an expectation. What do we think is going to happen? And we are basing cash flow decisions, spending decisions, program decisions based on what this plan is, right? So if you have this plan, then the next step is really to say, well, how did we do against our plan? And you can certainly wait until the end of the year and then take a look at it and do a look back. But at that point, it may not tell you very much. It may not provide insights that allow you to actually make different decisions, because at that point, it's purely historical. And you're already in a new year. You already have a new grant, right? So one of the things that we really recommend, and I think every organization is different, but identifying a certain cadence during the year for which either the treasurer or the board, preferably the board, might be looking at actual revenue and expenses against what the budgeted plan was. And for some organizations, that may make sense to happen monthly. It may make sense to happen quarterly, just so that you don't get halfway through the year or most of the way through the year and say, oh man, we're going to run out of money in December. So thinking about what makes sense. Other organizations, you may have one or two events that really fund your entire year. So I would think for those, you would want to review the budget to actual immediately following each of those events. Did we make it? Did we raise enough money? Did we raise more money so we can actually provide more services now? Whatever it may be. But I think just looking at your unique nonprofit and the operations and the funding streams and thinking, at what point is it important for us as a board to know where we are? And not making it overly burdensome either. If there's not a lot of value to be had reviewing monthly financials, then just look at them quarterly, because it's not about creating more work. The more work and the higher barriers you put on a process, the less likely it is that you're actually going to do the process, right? And the whole point is a better, more sustainable, more knowledgeable nonprofit. So again, just make it work for you. But I can't encourage enough the budget to actual comparison, because I think that's really can be powerful information for decisions. And it helps you also think through contingency plans. So if the event didn't go the way that you wanted it to, and you only have 2 events a year, maybe you schedule another event. Maybe your state fair, bake sale got rained out. So, hey, we're gonna try to go post up out by the, USA softball field and sell whatever. Like whatever it is, right? Contingency plans, but the sooner you have the information, the sooner you can make better decisions. And don't overcomplicate it. For fundraising income, this is really just thinking through those different components of your budget and making sure that you have helpful information for each piece. So kind of like we already talked about, for each event, you might have your own little budget, or at least if you don't have a separate budget, at least track those actuals, whatever the ticket sales were, whatever it was, in real time and record that. If you have an operation or activity or event that involves a lot of cash changing hands, first, I would really encourage, this is not budget related, really taking an intense look at whatever internal controls you have in place. So a check and balance. Hey, Susie's receiving the cash and Bob's the one who's counting it, like side by side, or whatever those are, right? It depends on your operation. I connect with some attorney friends that work in the nonprofit space probably 3 to 4 times a year. We try to meet quarterly. And the last 3 times I've met with them, because I'm always curious as a CPA, what are you all seeing on the law side of things, on the legal side, and what our clients are dealing with? And embezzlement has been hugely on the rise. And so it's disappointing, but I think it's really important to think about. And any dollars that disappear, it's funding that can't be used for the mission. So if you have cash events, just make sure you have some processes in place to protect that funding. The other thing I'll mention with cash related specifically to budgeting is that sometimes it doesn't end up getting recognized fully on the financials. So you may have the cash come in and then you may pay expenses with that cash, and so you don't really know how much you raised. If you say, oh, we raised this and then we're gonna pay the caterer, right? So just making sure that you have processes in place to recognize all of that revenue and have it counted and protected, and then accounting for all of the expenses. And for documentation as well, lack of documentation is kind of a pitfall that we see often. So maintaining receipts and keeping track of those expenses. I think sometimes organizations that are small, they're filing a Form 990 in e-postcard, and so there's not necessarily that check and balance for the financial side of things, where you don't have a CPA who's necessarily like, oh, well, where's your support for this, or where are your financials, or where's this, right? But just keeping in mind that nonprofits are still required to maintain receipts and documentation and have good financial records. So even though maybe no one is checking in on it or asking for it, there is still a responsibility to have that information available. And if you were audited, they would ask for that, and that could be problematic if you're not able to provide it. And the risk is always, the highest risk is just loss of exemption, right? Because then you're a for-profit, and that's not good. Here's just a sample fundraising budget. It's going to be in the same format as the other one. It's just kind of narrowed down at the fundraising event level. So, what were our ticket sales? We sold 100 tickets, $20 a piece or whatever it is. And then I also included that in-kind line item. So if you received, the ability to use a venue without paying for it, you would have that as in-kind revenue and then corresponding expense. I should have brought my Britney Spears mic because I usually like to be out here so I can, but I'm tied to this. My husband was like, you have to stay at the podium. I'm like, okay, fine. All right, and then you know what your net fundraising proceeds are. And then one thing that I cleverly did, right? So this 1,200 and this 1,100, right? Remember that goes back into, well, I didn't do it right, not very clever, but it's gonna come back over here to these. I must have changed it. Oh no, there it is. Okay, 1,900 and 1,100. So again, that feeds into your overall operating budget. Okay, to your excellent points, you were jumping way ahead. You were just really ready with the grant stuff. So when thinking about preparing grant budgets, and our friend over here really provided some excellent information. So when budgeting, thinking through what the timing of those grant notifications are, obviously putting them in the required format, reading through the application thoroughly. I work with a lot of funders. I work with private foundations and other nonprofits. And oftentimes they will say, hey, if we receive a grant request and it's not in the format that we asked for, they just decline it. And I don't know how much leeway the nation provides in some of that for you all, but I know some other donors may be really strict on that. And so really thinking about that format. Thinking through those allowable versus unallowable costs, which we talked a little bit about earlier. There are going to be specific items outlined in those grant applications that says, hey, you can buy the printer, but you can't buy the ink, right? Or whatever it is. And so really making sure that whatever budget you create for the grant accounts for only allowable costs, and then looking at the rest of your budget to see what might be able to cover something that, maybe it's a quality enhancement for the program that the grant won't pay for, but that you want to identify with other funds. So that's why it's also nice to have your fundraising budget, your grant budget, and then everything else. So you can kind of see, oh, well, remember we were going to budget that surplus, so maybe this other expense that the nation won't pay for, we can utilize that reserve, and it'll just lower our net for our budget. The other piece with budgets, I've worked with a lot of organizations, and sometimes one person will be in charge of writing the budget, and then the other person is in charge of writing the narrative. And then they don't always talk to each other in the right way. So making sure that whoever is drafting the budget, which in your guys' case, you may be doing both or all, I know, wearing a lot of hats, but just ensuring that both pieces align and that anything you changed for the budget, maybe from the prior year, gets reflected in the narrative, or if something is added to the narrative for program expenses, making sure that's reflected in the budget and that there's crossover. And for some expenses in your budget, it may be really obvious, like, utilities or electric bill, they're gonna know what that is. But if there is a generalized line item, you may want to provide some more narrative around that says, hey, this is what this expense actually represents, or consider breaking it out into additional line items if that doesn't upset the format for the budget. Really important on the grants is to read the grant agreement. It's going to outline even probably in more detail than the application what you can and can't spend on. thinking about those reporting deadlines and filing on time. And then I don't believe, just the Cherokee grants don't have a match requirement, do they? I don't think they do. Okay. And then one thing about reporting the in-kind revenue that we talked about earlier is that, if you don't report it as part of your budget or part of your financials, you're understating your revenue. So having that in there might bolster like kind of the presentation and strength of the nonprofit and of the presentation for the grant. The other piece I'll share is don't hesitate to ask the funder questions. I know you all have a great team with Vince and Tammy, and I think there's a lot of support there, but also for other funders. Funders exist because they want to provide support for your mission. That's their job, that's why they're there, and they want to help. And I would say 99% of the funders I've worked with have welcomed questions from grantees, and they would much prefer you come on the onset and say, hey, we're thinking about budgeting for this, but we're also thinking about this. Like, what do you think? What's going to give us the highest chance for receiving this funding? Really being curious, or even we were hesitant to put this line item in. We weren't sure what you would think. I've found that they really encourage transparency, and they really want to know what you're thinking because they want to take care of you, and they want to take care of the project or the mission or the program or whatever it may be. And then here's just a similar grant budget. This one includes an admin indirect. Some grants allow for 5% of the total grant amount or 10% or 15% or whatever to be for use just for administrative costs, postage, or whatever it may be. I think some of the Cherokee grants allow for that, maybe some don't. But just keeping in mind that, make sure that you know what that percentage is and that it's calculated correctly. And remembering that's a really nice tool because you don't have to actually explain what it's going to be spent on. Thank you, guys. Okay, thinking about prioritization is really making sure that the mission critical expenses that are needed to run your program or your event or whatever it may be, that those are prioritized first when you're budgeting. The other thing also is just you may identify some new funding streams, and one aspect that's really helpful to have this budget in place is sometimes you may be offered new funding to expand a program or run a new program, and just make sure that you're pulling the thread through to know what the impact is on your overall organization or your other programs, and if there are other hidden costs associated with taking on that specific project. So sometimes they say, oh, well, we'll just start doing this, but then not thinking, oh, it's actually going to add to our insurance costs or to this or that, and maybe that isn't part of that funding. So just really thinking about kind of the holistic viewpoint on that. We already talked about some of that. One of the big areas that budgeting can really help with is planning for cash flow. And, thinking through, like we talked about, what's the timing for those grants. I know you all are already doing that because you've been doing this, for years, but really thinking through what your projected expenses are beyond just next month, maybe looking out further. And then also assigning, you may leave this and say, hey, Stephanie told us we have to do a budget now, so we're going to do a budget. Making sure that, hey, who's gonna be in charge of that? What's the process going to look like? Who's going to review it? Is the board going to approve it? And then how are we going to actually use it as a tool? Because what I don't want to happen is for you to waste time, say, hey, we prepared a budget, we put it in a folder, and there it lays in peace, right? So like if you're gonna do it, just come up with a plan ahead of time that says, hey, we're gonna build this budget, we're gonna track our expenses against it, and we're gonna do it quarterly, right? Start small and just see how that changes the way that you operate your organization and see if it helps. Another key piece that came up earlier this morning was if you are creating monthly or quarterly or annual financials, try to build your budget in a way that it aligns with the format of your financials. So if you create a budget and it is in my format, but your financials are in a totally different format, you're gonna spend a lot of time trying to compare them because you're like, oh, well, this has one line item, but it's really made up of 3 line items, right? And so then you're gonna spend time and you're gonna be like, Stephanie, you didn't tell me this, right? So really put some forethought into it. And that's why the template I'm gonna provide in Excel is just gonna have like blank lines, right? So then you can look at your accounting records and say, okay, so we track ticket sales and we track fundraising expense and we track our grants. And you can kind of build it to mimic that. And so when you go to compare, hopefully it'll be a little bit easier. The other thing that I'll mention on the template, because I know not everybody has the Microsoft Office suite, so I'm going to send it in Excel, but then you can export it into Google Sheets, which is free if that's what you use. Or you can even print it to PDF or just print it to paper and just use it however you want if you want to handwrite it. I always want to encourage people to use technology, but again, this is intended to work for you and for your organization, and you don't have to learn Excel to implement a budget. So just make it work for you. I forgot to mention, I told my husband, he's also a partner at Core Business Advisors. We're partners in life and at work. But I was telling him, I forgot in the last session to mention, how cute is this little piggy guy? I was so excited about it, and then I forgot to call it out, and it's my favorite part of the whole presentation. So I digress. But when you are thinking about your budget check-ins, these are just a few questions to either ask yourself or to kind of bat around with somebody else, whoever you're looking at this information with. You know, hey, are we spent, like, I mean, you guys have your own money, right? Are we, you know, you're with your partner or whoever, you say, are we spending more than we planned? Right? So it's the same exercise. It's just a little bit more formalized feeling because it's with an organization. And then also, don't be afraid to tweak it as you go. Say, hey, oh, we didn't set this up the right way. Well, just fix it. Or our timing isn't aligning. Maybe we need to look at that differently for how we break it out. And I'm going to provide it in an annual snapshot, but then also monthly. And so you can get as detailed or as not as you want. And just, you know, budgets and really the strength of comparing to actuals and where you're at is really going to help you be more nimble. It's going to help you say, hey, we need to build in this contingency plan. We need to adjust. We need to cut back. We need to do something different, host that extra event, whatever it may be. And these are just some ideas for templates and examples of what might be helpful for you to track if you're not already tracking. I think a donation log is really, really helpful. I'm going to do a quick plug. If you are receiving donations over $250, those are required to have, from a single donor, those are required to have a donor acknowledgement letter sent for tax deductibility purposes. So just keep that in mind. And sometimes having the donor log helps us not forget about that. We get to the end of the year and you're like, oh, who do we need to send a letter to? That guy. Okay, cool. Yeah. For a non-cash donation? Like an art piece kind of thing? Yeah. So the donor should value. Yeah, they should tell you what the fair market value is. I made the joke in the last session because the same question came up and they said, well, they donated this chair and who values it? And I said, they have to value it because they are the ones taking the deduction, right, for tax purposes. And you don't know that it's this fancy antique chair that you are probably going to throw in the trash or whatever it is or give away. So yeah, have them value it. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Eye of the beholder, right? Mm-hmm. At $250, you need a donor acknowledgement letter. Mm-hmm. It's for tax purposes. Yep. It usually is structured as a thank you letter. Yep, but it's really a tax acknowledgement letter. Yeah, so they can provide their CPA that and say, hey, we're going to take a deduction for that. Yep. And they have templates and stuff. They stopped listening. It's okay. They have templates online. They have templates online for that too. If you need some support, you guys can email me. You know what? I love that. And that I am seeing that more and more because it's a thank you also, and it covers the organization so you're not missing anybody. So I think if it's not overly burdensome, I think that is a really great practice in general, just because why not? That's great. And just remember, if you are hosting an event, so if there was a gala, and let's say, this is kind of unrelated to this, but let's say somebody sponsors $1,000 for a table, and the dinner for the table costs $300 or is valued at $300, right? So of the 1,000, that donor acknowledgement letter is going to show $700 tax deductible as a contribution, and $300 is not deductible because they received that benefit. So they don't get to deduct the whole thing if they received something of value. So just keep that in mind.
Okay, any acknowledgement.
The value of the meal. Mm-hmm. For their business?
Yeah.
I don't think that works for the meals. I don't know. It is 50% deductibility for business meals, but how is that a business? How's it a business expense, I guess? Yeah, yeah, you could look at making that argument. I'm not going to give that tax advice here, but I can talk about it later. Okay. We are at time. That was really all I had. One thing that we added in the last section, one of the participants reminded me that there's this Microsoft for nonprofits. They offer certain discounts, and I think all you have to send them is your exemption letter or something. And I think it's pretty simple if you're looking at either if you're already paying for Microsoft Office Suite or something. But I thought that was a really good add-on. And then Adam, one thing I will share. So Adam is with the Oklahoma Center for Nonprofits. One of the things that came up in the last session was one of the attendees just said, we pay for QuickBooks and it's so expensive, and, should we do more manually, or should we look at Excel, or should we, and I encourage them, I said, I just encourage people to never move backwards from technology, because for a human to do the work, it is going to cost more. Even if it doesn't cost more today, eventually it will. But one of the things I directed them to the center, just to look at what possibly, Sandra and her team or whoever might be using if they have, I know there's free accounting software out there. I just hadn't used it. So I did do a plug for, it's a great source for assistance and recommendations. If you want to read, TechSoup. TechSoup.com.org. Okay, I'm putting it in the deck too, so you guys will have that. He's saying TechSoup. TechSoup. Oh, this pulled off. Hold on, I'll pull it back up. Okay, come on, Steph. What? Adam, is that right? Okay. And we're a couple minutes over, so, we can formally adjourn. But thank you all so much for attending this session. I hope thank you. I hope you all are able to take some tools back, and sorry if your other board members get mad at me because I said you need